That also, and I see you have a question also, and I'll get to that. Well, what is your question?
Well, I was just for the tests, like, are we still having that?
Yeah, so on your lecture tests, you can come in and go over one of them if you would like to do that. And that's available up through like the end of the semester. So as long as you do that before finals week, any lecture test you can come in and review if you haven't done that already and get points added back. Yeah, that is still an offer that is ongoing. In regards to Favor's question, put up where we stopped last time. So what's going to happen after exam 5 in lecture, which is next week? So next Monday we have lecture. Next Wednesday we have exam 5 in class. Next Friday is Good Friday, and that's a holiday for King. And then we come back and we have one more week of class before finals. So this is what's going to happen that last week of class. And I'm not going to go back and change the schedule that is in Canvas and update that document, but this is what it's going to be. So on Monday, the week after Easter, or that last week of class, we will go over exam 5. And we will have just a slight amount of new material. So there will be about half an hour of new material. And it's going to be kind of based on genetics stuff, but I will determine exactly what that half hour is later. So if there's some stuff that I don't finish from this unit, it will be that half hour. But if we finish everything in reproductive unit, it will be a little bit of genetics. And then on Wednesday of that week, we're going to do what I'm going to call a final exam overview. And what that is we're going to spend that lecture period to talk about what is the final exam like, and how do you approach it, and what are the rules to do the final exam. And this one, attendance is required. And like all you in here, you're pretty good at attending. But this one, in-person attendance is required to come to this. If you are not at this, you will have to set up a separate meeting with me before I will release your final exam. Then on Friday of that week, that day of class, I'm going to spend with pre-nursing students only. So if you're in here and you are next fall or next winter or at some time in the future going into the nursing program, I want to meet just with you all on Friday. And what we're going to do on that day is probably have like lunch or breakfast together. It may or may not be in this room, but we're going to take notes from this class and bind them together for you to use for the future. And I haven't done this before, but it's going to be called binding day. So we're binding notes, kind of like binding together with your friends that you're going to go through nursing school with, and kind of have a gathering before you go forward. So if you are not pre-nursing, you don't need to come that day. If you are pre-nursing, you come that day. And we're doing things that are not like related to new class material, but like set you off into the future as a nursing student. So I'm excited about that. And I might get some of the people who are about to graduate from nursing to also come that day. I'm hoping that's going to work out. But that, if you're exercise science or psych or human bio, you don't need to come that day, just pre-nursing. So that's the schedule for the last week of class. And then I think on Thursday night, so Thursday at 5 p.m., final exams appear on Canvas. So you get assigned to a particular final exam is your version, and those show up on Canvas at a certain time, and then you've got a week to work on it and you turn it in on Canvas. So during finals week, you're not going to come here at a certain time and take your final. So that's helpful to know as you're planning travel and stuff. The last day, if you're nursing, you need to be here on the last Friday class. If you're not nursing, the last time that you need to physically be here is the last Wednesday before finals week. And then it doesn't matter to me where you are after that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna die class.
At what time?
30 to 6.
Oh, okay, so this is like at 5 p.m., the exam is gonna show up on Canvas. And then you have a week to work on it and it's due a week later. So this is not anything like you need to be available for. That's just when they appear.
Is that Friday for pre-nursing students only the 29th?
It's the 22nd.
Okay, 22nd.
Yeah, so this is not finals week yet. This is the last week of class. So this would be 22nd. Somebody, thank you. You actually know what day it is. The 20th and then the 18th is the day after Easter. That's what's coming up. Yeah, good questions. That's what's coming up. And today we're going to be continuing talking about conception and also fetal development. And this is a really important topic. And as we go through this, I will be letting you know, like, these are the things you need to memorize. This is how this will appear on a certain exam question. So I think last time when we had stopped, I think we were maybe on this slide and talked about the formation of the zygote, which is a new single cell. It's the start of a new individual, and that's formed between a sperm, this sperm, I guess, fusing with this egg, and they're both delivering chromosomes that add up to be the new genes of the new individual. So zygote is a key vocabulary word here. And this is happening in the uterine tube, is where fertilization tends to happen. It's happening in the uterine tube. And as soon as the zygote forms, it starts going through cell divisions fairly quickly. So I like how your book shows this stuff in the red tends to be happening in the uterine tube. And you can imagine these versions of the new individual that has 2 or 4 or 8 cells, they are drifting through the uterine tube, heading toward the uterus. So kind of floating along and dividing as it goes. And then normally this being would be about 16 cells by the time it gets into the uterus. And then it gets to a stage called blastocyst. So the blastocyst is going to have 70 to 100 cells, and it's kind of a ball of cells with a space in the middle, blastocyst. So here's another view of kind of what that looks like. So we have ovulation, we have an oocyte bursting out of the ovary. It gets into the uterine tube, it gets fertilized there by the sperm. And then it floats along through the uterine tube, dividing as it goes until it reaches the uterus. And normally by the time it reaches the uterus, it's at this blastocyst stage. This level of development from zygote toward blastocyst is the beginning of embryo stage. So we would now call this an embryo. And the embryo, if it's going to continue developing, it needs to make it to the uterus, and it needs to attach itself to the lining, and that's called implantation. Normally, implantation are going to happen at blastocyst stage. And a lot of blastocysts that exist do not implant, and they keep drifting, and they drift on out of the uterus with the endometrium and are shed during the period. So something I want you to know about this stage of development is we know that this happens, and like we study it in other animals and look at it in a lab sense, but in a human woman, these stages of development and fertilization and blastocyst formation are basically invisible. And if you're listening to this later, I've got the word invisible in quotes. Like we could stick a microscopic camera up through the uterus and look around for this happening, but that's just technically difficult. And these events are in some ways mysterious and invisible to us from the outside. And it's a strange experience. Like someday, if you want to become pregnant, or you and your partner want to have a child, and you're trying to conceive, like the things that happen in this amount of time, you don't know what's going on. You can't see it, you can't detect it, and that's kind of strange to us in modern times. But those stages are kind of invisible to us, and there will be lots of blastocysts form, but we don't know it, and they didn't implant. And that's kind of invisible to us. So I'll come back to that concept in a minute. This is a picture from Google Image that I particularly like, and it's showing the same thing, showing ovulation, fertilization, which happens in the uterine tube to form the zygote, and then you have development continuing on, and then you eventually have implanted blastocyst. So what I want to do on this slide is kind of write in some timing of these events that aren't on here yet. And I want to start actually from ovulation. And so if you've got these slides and you're writing on it, right here, write the word ovulation. And write the word day 14 underneath. Why am I saying day 14? What does that mean?
14 days after.
14 days after the last period. So I'm gonna zoom back through the slides for a minute and show you something. Oh, it's on a different slide set. Okay, it's on a different slide set. But remember that in female cycle, we call day 0 the day the period tends to start. And then ovulation is usually 14 days after that. So we're going to relate this to menstrual period timing and say that day 14 of the cycle tends to be ovulation. And we're going to use that as our timing for going around this cycle here. So day 14 is ovulation. Fertilization, you could call that like day 15 or 16-ish, usually. And then these number of hours are since ovulation. So if this is day 14, this would be about day 18 right here. You could write day 18 is when blastocyst tends to form. And if we add 6 plus 14, it's around day 20 when the blastocyst tends to implant. Day 20 will be out here. And then I would like for you to kind of draw, hope this makes sense, like draw a couple arrows coming out from that. Because there's two options. We can't see this stuff happening. We can't detect this stuff happening. So if the blastocyst does not implant, we don't consider the person pregnant. So if the person's not pregnant, if the blastocyst doesn't implant, then around 28 days, if the woman is on a 28-day cycle, she would get her period, her menstrual period. But, yeah, say that.
She said if it's not implanted.
If it
then-
doesn't implant, or it was never fertilized in the first place, and we don't know, like, we can't detect what actually happened. It's in the mystery time, it's in the pre-implantation time. The woman would get her period. And like normally we think of, you know, when you get your period, oh, I didn't conceive. Possible you had a blastocyst and it didn't implant, but we can't detect that. So either period happens at 28 days, or if there is a pregnancy and the blastocyst did implant or undergo implantation, hopefully you don't get your period and the endometrium stays there to nourish the embryo. We'll just use stays. It's not the most scientific word. But the endometrium is going to stay put to nourish the embryo. And so how do I know if I'm pregnant or not sense, what's easiest to tell is, did a period happen or did a period not happen? I won't ask you all to like volunteer this, but I'm gonna ask like this rhetorical question to myself. Self, if I missed my period, how long would it be before I noticed that fact for myself? And I have never been very like good at tracking my period. I have a Fitbit now. It's supposed to be helping, but anyway. So I think it would take about a week. Like if you're busy and you're just like, whatever, maybe a week. If you're super regular, maybe 3-4 days later. It depends on the person. So we're gonna put like question mark, how many days would it take you to notice? If your cycles aren't regular, like if you don't have a regular cycle, and sometimes it's 35 and sometimes it's 26, or sometimes you missed your period totally because of different health reasons, it might take you a long time to notice. If that's how you're measuring pregnancy. So that's one way to detect pregnancy. We're going to see that there's going to be 3 basic ways. How do we detect pregnancy? One of them is to notice a missed period, which might mean that you're pregnant. It's a good indicator. Not every missed period is because of pregnancy, but it's a good indicator. The second way that we can detect pregnancy, let me write this number one a little bit closer to the missed period info. Okay, second way that we can detect is to detect hormone increase, a certain hormone increase via a home pregnancy test. And these are the ones that you buy at the store. And what they are detecting is levels of a certain hormone called HCG, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. It's quite a mouthful, but HCG is the abbreviation for this. And this particular hormone, women don't start making it until there's implantation. That's when it starts to actually get at a kind of high level. And so it's made in the body and it circulates through the woman's blood and it filters through into her urine during glomerular filtration. So it shows up in the urine also. So when it gets to a high enough level, you can pee on a stick and the urine is carrying the hormone up to this level. And then when it binds to a certain antibody that fits its shape, it makes a line show up. And now that people have done this kind of COVID test, like when I undid the rapid COVID test, like, oh, this looks just like a pregnancy test. So if you don't pee on it, you put some, swished solution on it. Works the same way. So home pregnancy tests are going to be able to detect that increased HCG hormone at a certain range of days. So the more expensive tests can detect it 3 days after implantation. Like the super cheap ones that you buy at Dollar Tree or wherever, those actually do work. It might take them a little bit longer it may take you a little bit longer to get enough hormone that they detect because they're cheaper. But those are going to detect pregnancy 3 to 8 days after implantation. After implantation. So we look back at this thing here. So the blastocyst implants, and that will start kicking off this HCG hormone being made, and it takes 3 to maybe like 8 days, depending on the test cheapness, for those levels to show up on a test. So that's way number 2 that you can detect a pregnancy. Way number 3, we'll get to that in a few minutes. Real briefly, if couples have been trying to conceive and it's not working, and then they go through other testing to determine maybe like what their problem is, your choices at that point are maybe like, well, maybe we can do adoption, or if we really want to have a child that's genetically our child, do in vitro fertilization. And the way that works is sperm and eggs are mixed outside the body in a lab, and lab technicians determine microscopically, like, okay, we've got some zygotes, we've got some embryos now. And then once you have verified that has worked, then you can put the embryos basically through a catheter up into the woman's uterus and try to get them to implant there. And that's called in vitro fertilization. It's really expensive. I've had multiple friends that have had enough money to try it once and it didn't work. And then they're put into this position like, okay, now what do we do? Do we save up? Do we try to pursue adoption? Do we give up? It's usually not covered by insurance, which is an interesting economic question. During this process, there are usually more than one embryo that come out of it. And a lot of times the clinic that does this will freeze the others, which is another like interesting question. Like, then what happens to those? Then what happens? They kind of sit there and wait. And there was a case a few years ago when the clinic, they lost power and the freezer went down and everyone's embryos thawed and died or were destroyed, and it became a big, terrible fiasco. Hopefully, like, yeah, was there a question?
You said there's more than one created.
Almost always, yeah. And also the technicians can kind of look at them and see which ones look the best and which ones less so, which is also an interesting ethical question. Like, what about the not best ones? I kind of get a little score. How good do you look? How healthy do you look? Okay, so returning to implantation, whether it's natural or in vitro. The blastocyst is going to implant into the uterus and it needs to burrow into the endometrium. So this is showing blastocyst, and it kind of attaches into the endometrium, and then it will kind of burrow in, or the endometrium also grows around it. So it becomes kind of encased. It's like it's embedded in the wall, which is pretty interesting. And there are certain parts of the uterus that are better spots for embryo implantation than others. So this is showing, okay, what parts of the uterus from a front view here in the purple are the best spots if you're looking from the front. And then if you're looking from the side, the best places are kind of the posterior wall. So more toward the back. More toward the back. And kind of up high-ish are the best spots for implantation. And when I say the best spots, I mean the ones that will allow for a continuous and healthy pregnancy upcoming. Sometimes the embryo does not implant in the best spot. It implants at a place where there might be some endometrium, but not enough to have a long-term ongoing pregnancy. And when that happens, it's called ectopic, an ectopic pregnancy. So kind of the definition of that is the embryo implants, the blastocyst, implants in a spot that won't support long-term growth. Or let's say long-term development. About 2% of detected pregnancies are ectopic, and depending on where the implantation happened, we can call it a tubal pregnancy if it implants in the uterine or fallopian tube, or if it's down below in the uterus, it's called cervical pregnancy. These kind of have different problems for long-term growth. So if the embryo keeps growing here, this is just not enough tissue to support its long-term growth. And you can't have a placenta up here. That will not work long-term. If implantation is too low, basically you can't have a placenta down here because it's going to block the, number one, it's going to block the cervix. And number two, see how the lining here is kind of thin and the lining here is thick? You need implantation in a thick lining spot of the uterus, not a thin. So these pregnancies will start and they develop and will cause missed period, will cause detectable pregnant, you're pregnant on a home test, but they're not going to persist long term. So that kind of leads into what's the third way that pregnancy is detected? There's actually two other ways, but what are some other ways that we can verify somebody's pregnant? Yeah. Like you can see it from the outside. By the time you can see it, that's kind of late. And that is a way, like a pretty reliable way. Especially if you know them well. But let me say, if you see somebody that looks like they might be pregnant, you don't know them well, don't be like, oh, congratulations. It might just be gaining weight. But if you know them well, that's a pretty good way. What's the other way? Ultrasound. Yeah. Ultrasound. And so in developed Western countries with modern medicine, you tend to get an ultrasound at about 6 weeks, we'll say 6 to 8 weeks pregnant. And what they're doing there is taking, you've probably seen these black and white pictures and the people are like, there it is. And you're like, okay, it's a dot. But what they're doing is taking ultrasound wand and kind of scanning around, and they are looking for something like this, which on the ultrasound screen, it looks like a dark hole with a lighter dot in it, and that's what they're scanning for. So a lot of women who have ectopic pregnancies, you know, a lot of them would be like really wanted to get pregnant, missed a period, test positive on the home test, go for the ultrasound, and the ultrasound person will be scanning around and they eventually find it, but it's not where they were looking. And someday I would like to talk to an ultrasound tech and ask them, like, how do you train for that moment when you have to go get the doctor and the doctor comes in and tells the person, you've got you're pregnant, but it's implanted in the wrong spot and this pregnancy will not persist. And that's a very sad moment, and that actually happens quite a lot. So it'll happen to somebody you know in your lifetime, but they may not tell you. Mm-hmm.
Like, do they stop it, or does it like, it's just like nature does its course? And
It's kind of both. It's kind of both. So right now, we do not have the technology, once we know that this has happened, to move it. That day may come like in the next 30 years, but we're not there yet to say, oh, okay, let's move it over to a better spot. That's not currently feasible. So the two options after this are to, number one, wait. This is options for ectopic pregnancy. And number one, and your book had the most like dry clinical description of this. I was going to cut and paste it. It had this statement like, blah, 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 number of ectopic pregnancies will resolve on their own or resolve naturally. It could be that the embryo that doesn't get, it's not going to get enough nourishment at a certain point, and it might kind of die on its own and then be released in like a huge period later on. So what we're going to write that is release of the embryo and shed via late menstruation. There's actually three things that can happen. Number one is the best option. It's not a good option, but it's the best of the three. Number two is that the woman's reproductive tissues rupture. And that's especially can happen if it's an ectopic tubal pregnancy. Going to rupture the tube, and then that causes some health complications for the mom, and also would cause her to basically lose that half of her fertility, let's say. Ruptured tube is not going to be a long-term healthy tube for future oocytes to come from that direction. And we'll just write here, rupture and can cause trauma to the mom. Number three is surgical removal. And I'll put surgical / drug. And women that know that they have an ectopic pregnancy, like depends on where it is and what stage it is, and then their medical provider will counsel them which one of these would be the best. And sometimes this would be the best. And doing that is the definition of an abortion. So one reason I like to slow down in this section is that I wish like everybody that talked about abortion would have this class and have some like this knowledge of how it works so that you know what you're talking about when you talk about abortion and who can get one and who can't get one, because women that have ectopic pregnancies sometimes need an abortion even if they desperately wanted that child. So like I don't know what's supposed to happen to them. Like if states have law, you can't get an abortion no matter what, unless you're going to literally die without it. Well, what about them? What's going to happen to them? Because sometimes you need an abortion. Sometimes if you wait for, like if you got counsel that and you really didn't want to, you don't have to. You can wait for it to rupture, take your chances, and lose half of your ability to have future kids. But that's just, I don't know, it's important to know this. It's important to know this. And not everything we're going to talk about today is so grim, but I think it's really important to know that because you're going to know people that this happens to. And if you know 5 in your life that it happens to, there's likely that one of them will need a surgical intervention in that case. I had it happen to a student.
Would they also, like, if that did happen, would they call it a miscarriage?
Yeah, so these, I love that question. These 2 options would be considered a miscarriage. This one, if you have surgical intervention to cause it to go ahead and happen and not wait for this, that would be called an abortion. But I would suspect that most women who wanted, I mean, I know that they would, if they had the surgical intervention and they did want that child, they would later tell you, if they chose to tell you, that they had a miscarriage. That answer, yeah. Miscarriage, if you lose a pregnancy before it's a certain week, before a certain week, it's called a miscarriage, and after that, it's called a stillbirth. Come back to that in a minute. Good question. So we're gonna like go on now and talk about pregnancies that do persist, and they have implanted in a good spot. And we can see here that the embryo has implanted into the uterine wall and it's developed more, and now it starts to look like more like a person. So it's actually proceeded quite far in its development. And it floats in this fluid called amniotic fluid. So you start your life floating in dark, warm liquid. That's just interesting. Think about. That's the amniotic fluid. And during early pregnancy, there will be formation of this structure called placenta. So this is showing kind of how the placenta looks at an early stage and how it connects with the mom's uterus. So placenta is really essential to form correctly to provide good growth for the, good growth for the embryo. And it's an exchange structure. So it's going to receive through the umbilical cord nutrients and oxygen and hormones and some antibodies from the mom. So it's getting like everything it needs basically from her body. And it will also send wastes back to the mom's body and CO2. So the placenta is basically doing everything for the embryo, and the mom is doing everything for the placenta. So it's an exchange structure between the mom's uterus and the fetus's umbilical cord, and it's got a really rich blood supply. This is a picture of a placenta that was delivered after birth. So this is a full size one, and this was something that I had not looked at before until I was, about to have a baby. And they are really big by the time that they are at the end of pregnancy. And you can see here a piece of the umbilical cord that had been connected to the newborn. It's bloody.
Wait, so the whole thing is the placenta?
That whole thing is the placenta, yes.
Is it always that big when it comes out? Like,
It ought to be about that big. So look back, when we talk about what's a good spot for implantation, like if you have implantation here, by the time the uterus gets huge, the placenta is not blocking the birth canal. It's big. And like, think about how big a full-term pregnant belly is. The placenta is covering up about like a third of the size of it. Like, that's a good.
and that whole thing always comes
Like, imagine that. That's about the size of a pregnant belly, that backpack right there. And the placenta would be covering up about a third of the inside surface.
So that thing comes out every time you give birth?
Yes, it does.
I've never seen that.
I didn't know that either till I had a child. You have to deliver the placenta. That's like a bummer. But we'll talk about that when we get to pregnancy.
So it's like the placenta, like also a reason like the belly is so big, not just because it's baby, but
It's mostly baby, but the placenta, it does represent some of the weight you gain. Yeah, yeah. So there is one. Okay, so now that we get to, like, this is the quiz answers for today. The fetus So we'll get into the stages in a minute, but the fetus is not easy to tell what sex it is actually until weeks 9 to 12. So it will have a chromosomal sex, like it's XX or XY, but to see the reproductive organs and detect them on a ultrasound needs to be between weeks 9 and 12. This meconium substance is the feces of the fetus. And the way the fetus gets oxygen is through the placenta. Your quiz questions for today. Okay, so I wanna start with this picture. And what this is a collection of embryos, some of which are shown here, that were collected over the years from various pregnancies that were lost in some way. So maybe they were ectopic and they had surgery, or there was a miscarriage and they donated the fetus to science. And they were put into this collection called the Carnegie collection. And from these, I lost the word for what, embryologists is the term, studied their progression and studied their ages, and they developed this set of different anatomical stages called Carnegie stages. And this is showing Carnegie stages during embryonic development. And we start here with the zygote, which is blown up big. And it just starts as this little dot. And so this is showing you how many days in the small letters, and then the bigger numbers are what's called Carnegie stages. So this picture, I think, is extremely useful, and I wish I had seen it when I was a younger person, to kind of, it's interesting in the first place, and it kind of shows you what develops at what time. So all of this is pretty early development right here. And something to note about this is that these days of development are starting from day 1 of zygote formation. So see how they're saying, okay, here's zygote, that's 1 day, and then by 15 to 17 days, it's this big, and by 31 to 35 days, it's this big, and so on. Make a note right here, up here or at the bottom in the white space, that weeks of pregnancy, so these days plus 2 weeks equals weeks of pregnancy. I'm going to write that here on the board. If this shows up. So whatever time they're listing on here, plus 2 weeks equals weeks of pregnancy. Because remember, talking about these stages, ovulation happens at day 14 of the female cycle, but we can't see it. Like we can't detect the moment of fertilization. So when we talk about weeks of pregnancy, we date pregnancy from LMP, which is last menstrual period, and we have that coming up in a slide pretty soon. Yeah, what goes in the quotations are these timings here. So let me make it a parentheses, not the quotations. That would make more. So in parentheses, when it says zygote is 1 day, like that'd be day 15, or we're adding on the 2 weeks that it took to get ovulation in the first place. Does that make sense what I'm getting at here? Yeah.
So does that mean that, basically it's like the germinal stage starts from week 1 to 2, embryonic stage starts from 3 to 8, and fetal stage starts from 9 to basically to 40?
Yeah, of weeks of pregnancy.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's coming up in a slide too. Okay, good. Okay, so these times on this, if you want to know how many weeks pregnant that is, you add 2 weeks onto those number of days. Or 14 days, yeah. Yeah, so what that means is that, and this is weird, and it took me a while to understand this the first time I ever was pregnant, is that the day of fertilization, if it's successful, you would be considered 2 weeks pregnant. That's weird. That's weird to think about. And so I've got some arrows drawn on here. So what was this arrow? Oh, I remember what this arrow was. Okay. So this arrow would indicate that, let me make sure I've got this right. It's about this time that you can detect on a pregnancy test that you're pregnant. Around there. Or notice that you missed your period. If you are not right on top, like what days. That's usually when you might notice that you're pregnant or test positive on a pregnancy test. And this arrow represents 6 weeks pregnant. So that's been like a very in the news deadline. Like, can you get an abortion past 6 weeks or not? That's about the stage, 6 weeks pregnant right there. So those 2 arrows I have drawn in for that reason. So let's look next at a couple of things. So a few years ago, when I first started teaching this class, I saw this, I guess it's a meme, and it had certain things on it that were correct and certain things not correct. And I'm going to use that in class and talk about what is accurate and what is slightly misleading. So there's a picture here of an embryo, and it says the foundation for every organ system is already established and beginning to develop, and that's totally true. And this is definitely a human embryo. But the age of it is a little bit like, it says in purple weeks. This says baby in the womb at 3 weeks. What does this mean, 3 weeks? And what age is this actually? Because that becomes really important when we talk about what are you actually aborting or having a surgical ectopic pregnancy procedure. So this is what 3 weeks pregnant is. This is not really 3 weeks. This is something longer than 3 weeks. So let me go backward actually. Okay, so 3 weeks pregnant would be 7 days of embryonic development about, plus the 2 weeks that you have to get to ovulation. So that would be like somewhere over in here. 3 weeks. Or sorry, 3 weeks of development, 3 weeks of embryonic development. There's this, yeah. This is 3 weeks of embryonic development. Like it's been growing for 3 weeks. This would be 5 weeks pregnant. Is it possible to be pregnant and still have your period? You should not be having a big period. I've heard of this happening to people though. So let me go back and address that, how that can happen. I love that question. We need this. Okay. So imagine that you get implantation at a certain time and you start to have your period. You start to have your period implanted right before it started. And so if that timing is kind of like implanted at the last minute, which can happen in some women, you may shed some lining a little bit, but if the part where the embryo is managed to stay, you can keep that pregnancy. So I hear this from time to time. There are women that had, they thought they had their period and it was really light. You're like, huh, okay. And then you go on about your life. And then the next month you didn't have it. And then you go to the ultrasound and they can see how big the embryo is and then say, no, you're further along than you think. That can happen once in a while. Yeah. Good. I like that question. Had a friend that happened to. So this is about 3 weeks that the embryo's been developing, and about 5 weeks pregnant would be this. This is an embryo. This did come from a pregnancy, but it's older than that. It's kind of older than that. So if the embryo has been developing about 5 weeks, I took this picture from your book because it was already there. You'd already seen it. This is about 5 weeks of embryo development time, so about 7 weeks of pregnancy, and it's about Carnegie stage 15 or 16. And it doesn't, I don't know, it looks kind of unusual, I guess you could say. 2 weeks later, so very, very soon after, 2 more weeks of development, looks like this. This is about 9 weeks of pregnancy, about Carnegie 19. So when we're thinking about, like, there's so much to think about here. When do we consider the embryo a person? There are so many questions that go along with that. And one time I got Dr. Streetman to come into an honors class. I used to teach an honors class about this stuff. And he talked about how would philosophers define a person? That was so interesting. All of these are something different than the parent. And all of them are the potential to be a new person. And as they grow and grow, they become more and more definitely a person. So going between like this and this, that's a short amount of time. That's a short amount of time. And I think seeing what these beings look like is really helpful to help think about this. They're definitely, they're different than the mom. They are not genetically the same as the mom. Mm-hmm. Form fully, we're getting there. Yeah. The question was how many weeks to form fully? We're getting to that. Okay, so these next few slides that we're going to start on next time, they have a lot of those definitions. So several definitions. And actually, I'm going to pop these up and have you all maybe take pictures of them, because this is very key. And this slide and the next have a lot of words on them. So here they are. Your phone's good enough to get that picture from the back. Yeah. And then there's one more coming up that has a lot of words that are super important. And we'll go through the words next time, but be good to start looking at them. Okay, going to the next picture. Those two. If you're worried about exam 5, start studying this stuff. These definitions, that'll help. So let me go back to the previous one in case you didn't get that one. Okay, see you Friday. Have a really good day.
No, I like writing.
Some people do.
Okay, I go to the
Yeah.
I know.
Hunter, your question about fully formed, it's about 37 weeks. But they can be born significantly before that and live. They just take some time to get caught up with their development.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.